The Australian Institute of Criminology is pleased to announce the publication of our Cybercrime in Australia 2024 report and share some of the key findings from our annual Australian Cybercrime Survey. The survey was first conducted in 2023 and is an annual survey that collects national data to track trends in cybercrime victimisation, help seeking and harms, and better understand and identify emerging cybercrimes. We developed the survey because we identified a gap in what data is available to measure cybercrime in order to help inform prevention efforts. We wanted a single source of data that could accurately capture the dark figure of unreported cybercrime, and importantly, look at trends across time for a range of different forms of cybercrime. An important new feature of this year's report is that we're able to compare results from 2023 to 2024. So today I'll be talking about our findings from this year and how they've changed since last year. We've also developed the Cybercrime Dashboard, which has all the information on victimisation prevalence, help seeking, financial losses, and other harms that the annual report covers, along with interactive filters to look at trends and changes across time, according to different socio-demographic characteristics like age, gender, or status as a small to medium business owner. Both the report and dashboard are available on the AIC website. Each year, our cybercrime survey is completed by a minimum of 10,000 respondents. The sampling method we use for the survey is designed to recruit people from around Australia who are demographically representative of the wider population. So, for example, the size of our sample from each state and territory reflects the proportion of the population from each of those jurisdictions. And this year, as with last year, there was a high concordance between our sample and the wider Australian population in terms of age, gender, employment, education, whether they were born overseas, and their level of remoteness. So this figure shows the percentage of respondents who were a cybercrime victim in the 12 months prior to the 2024 survey. In that period, nearly 1 in 2 respondents had experienced at least one form of cybercrime. The most common was online abuse and harassment, which refers to online communication to or about an individual that might cause them emotional distress. It includes receiving unsolicited sexually explicit content, someone impersonating the respondent online, and cyberbullying. 21% had been the victim of malware, which is short for malicious software and refers to software that is specifically used to access or harm a computer system or network and can be used to steal confidential information. And this includes ransomware. 22% had been the victim of identity crime and misuse, and these are incidents where a person's personal information is obtained or used without their permission, usually as a means of obtaining some kind of financial benefit. Victims most often reported suspicious transactions appearing in their financial accounts, receiving calls from debt collectors asking about unpaid bills that they didn't recognise, and their details being used to purchase or order something. 1 in 10 respondents had been the victim of fraud or scams, which involves the intentional deception of someone to obtain money or something else of value, such as personal details. The most common type of fraud and scam in the 12 months prior to the survey were all related to buying or selling products or services online. So these types of scams accounted for 43% of the most recent scams reported by victims. We asked scam and fraud victims in the most recent incident if it began with the scammer sending them an unsolicited message, SMS or email, and we found that 1 in 3 scams started with one of these phishing messages. So this is important in understanding how scam victims are targeted. So this slide compares cybercrime victimisation from 2023 to 2024, and the asterisks show where there's a significant difference between the 2 years. The 2024 prevalence figures are slightly different from the previous slide, as here we're using adjusted estimates to account for differences between the samples in different years and to exclude new types of cybercrime that we measured in 2024 but not in 2023. So we can see that while the overall prevalence of having experienced any cybercrime in the past year remained the same, in 2024 there was a smaller proportion of respondents who reported being the victim of online abuse and harassment, malware, and fraud and scams. Additionally, in our cybercrime survey, we asked respondents if they'd experienced a data breach in the past year. We don't include this in our estimates of cybercrime victimisation, either overall or as a form of identity crime and misuse, but more as a risk factor and precipitating event. As we know from previous research that we've conducted, the data breaches are associated with an increased risk of cybercrime victimisation. When we compared the estimates for 2023 and 2024, we found there was a significant decrease in the proportion of respondents who had experienced a data breach in the 12 months prior to the survey, from about a third to about a quarter. Now, an important part of the picture, which the cybercrime survey is also able to measure, is polyvictimisation, which is the extent to which respondents experience more than one type of cybercrime in a certain period. This Venn diagram shows the prevalence of victimisation according to the combination of the 4 major types of cybercrimes reported by victims. So for example, 3.1% of respondents, which is the centre segment of the diagram, said they had experienced all 4 types of cybercrime. In 2024, over a third of victims experienced multiple types of cybercrime in the past year. However, promisingly, when we compare this figure with last year, there was a decrease in the proportion of victims who experienced multiple types of cybercrime from 43.2% to 39.4% of victims. Another really important feature of the survey is our ability to identify individuals who are at higher risk of falling victim to different kinds of cybercrime. Both the 2023 and 2024 surveys found that individuals with certain socio-demographic characteristics and online behaviours are consistently at risk of being a cybercrime victim. So for example, First Nations respondents, those living with a disability, and small to medium business owners are more likely to experience all 4 forms of cybercrime. Additionally, cybercrime is higher among individuals who use the internet more frequently, who are actually more confident in their technology knowledge and ability, who use certain platforms, and who engage in certain higher risk online activities. Notably, in both the 2023 and 2024 surveys, we found that respondents who use certain online safety strategies in the past 12 months were more likely to be a victim of cybercrime in the past 12 months. We believe that this might be because respondents are taking steps to improve their online behaviour after they've fallen victim. Now, while small to medium business owners have a higher likelihood of victimisation for all 4 types of cybercrime compared to other respondents, when we compare cybercrime victimisation for 2023 and 2024, they were less likely to report being the victim of malware in the 12 months prior to the survey and were less likely to report being the victim of fraud and scams. Looking at online safety strategies, when we compare the use of online safety measures from 2023 to 2024, there was a lower proportion in 2024 who said they had used several safety strategies, including avoiding clicking on links or attachments when they were not certain of who the sender of a message was, installing or using antivirus software or firewalls on their devices, checking their privacy settings on social media accounts, independently contacting companies or government departments when they're unsure of an SMS or email they'd received, changing their privacy settings on social media accounts from the default to a more restricted setting, using a secure password manager, and for those who were living with children at the time, setting or using parental controls to restrict access to certain content. So what this tells us is that many respondents are not taking important but simple steps to improve their online safety. One of the benefits of a self-report survey of the community is that we can measure cybercrime that isn't reported. We ask victims about their help seeking from a range of people and organisations, including ScamWatch, eSafety, banks, the ATO, their friends and family, and workplaces. This analysis can be found in the Cybercrime in Australia 2024 report. Here I'll focus on Police and Report Cyber, which is the main online reporting platform for reporting cybercrime to police. We can see that for the majority of cybercrime incidents, victims do not seek help from police or report cyber, and even less make an official report. We can use the proportion of victims who submitted an official report to produce multipliers, which can be applied to recorded data to estimate how much cybercrime we're missing. So for example, we can say that for every official report of identity crime and misuse that is reported to police or report cyber, there's 8.7 that go unreported over that same period. And likewise, for every fraud or scam that's reported, there are 7 that are not reported. So given we know that cybercrime is reported to report cyber every 6 or 7 minutes, this gives some sense as to the potential unmet demand that exists in the community. But there are some promising signs. We compared the proportion of victims who sought help, advice or support from police or report cyber in 2023 and 2024. And there was an increase in the proportion of victims who sought help for online abuse and harassment and for malware attacks. We then repeated the analysis for small to medium business owners who were the victims of cybercrime. And again, there were increases in the proportion who sought help for online abuse and harassment, malware attacks, and identity crime and misuse. We then asked victims what happened when they made a report to report cyber or police. The outcomes ranged from not having heard anything following the report and not knowing what happened, through to being told by police that someone had been arrested, charged, or prosecuted. Between 19 and 39% of victims had either heard nothing or didn't know what happened, or were told that nothing could be done. The most common outcome was being told that their complaint would be investigated, but either not having heard anything yet or being told that the complaint was now closed or could not be progressed further. Between 8 and 21% of victims were told by police that someone had been arrested, charged, or prosecuted. We also asked victims how satisfied they were with the outcome of their report and found that generally victims who reported the most recent incident to police or report cyber were more likely to be satisfied than dissatisfied with the outcome of their report. So up to 61% of victims who sought help were satisfied with the outcome, and up to 36% were dissatisfied with the outcome. Satisfaction is tied to the reasons that victims make a complaint. So across both years, the most common reason for going to police or report cyber was to prevent the crime from happening to them or to someone else, and to generally make the online environment safer. But why do many people not report to police or report cyber? There's lots of reasons, but the most common fall into two broad categories. Some victims didn't report because the incident wasn't serious enough. There may be this perception among victims that if they didn't lose money or there wasn't a great amount lost, it wasn't a serious enough offence. Our data does show that average losses are higher among victims who report. The second major reason is that a large proportion of victims didn't know how or where to report. And that's clearly an area where more can be done to raise awareness of reporting options among victims, and also address some of the confusion that might still exist about there being multiple reporting options. We've also found that there is still a stigma for some cybercrime victims. So for example, 15% of fraud and scam victims who didn't make a report to police or report cyber said that it was because they felt embarrassed or ashamed. So the Cybercrime Survey captures a range of information about the harm that victims experience as a result of their victimisation. For financial losses, we ask respondents a range of questions about how much money they lost, how much they spent dealing with the consequences of victimisation, and how much they were able to recover. Notably, most victims report losing no money from the most recent incident, and among those who do lose money, the majority lose less than $1,000. However, a small group of victims did lose substantial amounts of money. This was especially true for online abuse and harassment victims, where 1 in 20 victims reported losing more than $10,000 in the most recent incident. These incidents are most likely to be reported to authorities and tend to be reflected in estimated losses based on recorded data. These results suggest that individual losses associated with cybercrime victimisation can vary widely, but most frequently it's a high-volume, low-yield crime, which can still be lucrative for offenders even if the amount lost per victim is relatively low. But the harms also extend beyond these financial losses. We measure a whole host of harms experienced by cybercrime victims in a way that hasn't been done before. We ask victims about the consequences they had experienced in the 12 months prior to the survey as a result of their victimisation. The survey asked about 34 items in total, grouped into 5 domains. So these are practical impacts, such as the loss of confidence in using the internet, impacts on a person's ability to communicate with others, or problems accessing online accounts and resources. Social impacts include a loss of trust in other people, increased feelings of isolation, and relationship conflicts. Health impacts include mental or emotional distress, trouble sleeping, and deteriorating health. Financial impacts is independent of how much a person actually lost, but refers to consequences such as a respondent experiencing an increase in financial stress, having to borrow money from friends or family, and an increase in time or money they spent gambling. Legal impacts are when a victim had to commence legal action or when they'd been in trouble with the police. So this figure compares the proportion of respondents who reported experiencing these harms or any harm in 2023 and 2024. Over half of the victims in both years experienced at least one harm as a result of their victimisation. Across both years, practical and social harms were the most common and legal issues were comparatively rare. Importantly, as represented by the asterisks, there was an increase in the proportion of victims who experienced social harm and health-related harms and overall harm. So for social harm, this increase was driven in large part by feelings of embarrassment and reputational harm. While for health-related harms, there were increases in issues such as difficulty sleeping and consumption of alcohol. We also asked small to medium business owners about whether and how their business was impacted as a result of the cybercrime they experienced in the 12 months prior to the survey. So this figure compares 2023 and 2024 and shows that we found no significant changes in the types of harm or overall harm. But you can see that the impacts owners experienced on their businesses were substantial. So in 2024, 42% experienced some kind of harm as a result of the cybercrime they experienced. Over a quarter reported disruption to everyday business function, 15% had additional business expenses, 13% had impacts on their reputation and revenue, 13% lost business, customer, or staff data, 6% reported impacts on their staff, and 1 in 20 experience legal or regulatory sanctions, which, while rare, can be quite detrimental. So there are some key messages that we can take away from the 2024 annual report. In general, the patterns we see in victimisation, risk factors, help seeking and harms have generally stayed consistent from 2023 to 2024, although we did see some changes. Cybercrime victimisation remained prevalent within the sample, with nearly half of all respondents having been a victim of cybercrime in the 12 months prior to the survey. Online abuse and harassment was the most common, with 27% of respondents having been a victim, followed by identity crime and misuse, malware, and scams and fraud. Repeat victimisation is also a concern, with 39% of victims experiencing multiple kinds of cybercrime in the past year. However, notably, there were declines from 2023 to 2024 in the prevalence of online abuse and harassment, malware, and fraud and scams, and a decline in repeat victimisation in the 12 months prior to the survey. We also observed a decline in the prevalence of data breaches in 2024. We found that certain sections of the community continue to be overrepresented as victims, as are individuals who engage in certain online behaviours and use certain platforms. Small to medium business owners continue to be at higher risk of all 4 types of cybercrime. However, in 2024, they were less likely to be the victim of malware and the victim of fraud and scams than in 2023. This might be attributable to the significant focus that's been given to preventing cybercrime among small to medium business owners and operators in the last few years. Thinking about risk and protective measures, we found that the uptake of online safety measures among our sample is generally quite low. In the 12 months prior to the survey, less than half installed or used an antivirus, only a third changed their privacy settings on social media accounts from the default to a more restricted setting, and just over a quarter used a secure password manager. Moreover, we saw declines in the proportion of respondents who engaged in several of these activities from 2023 to 2024. This makes it clear that respondents are not taking simple but effective steps to improve their online safety. Official reporting among cybercrime victims remains low. Between 9.5% of malware victims and 12.5% of fraud and scam victims made an official report to police or report cyber. When asked why they didn't make a report, victims most often believe that the incident was not serious enough or they didn't know how or where to report. So this highlights the continued need to raise awareness of reporting options among victims and address some of the confusion that might still exist about there being multiple reporting options. Nevertheless, there were increases in the proportion of victims making official reports for online abuse and harassment and malware, as well as online abuse and harassment, malware, identity crime, and misuse for small to medium business owners specifically. This might help explain why we saw a decline in repeat victimisation. Victims who seek help, support, or advice following an incident might be more likely to implement online safety strategies and other prevention measures that then reduce their risk of falling victim a second time. Finally, we continue to see this year that the range and extent of harms caused by cybercrime victims is significant, with 57% of all victims reporting harm from cybercrime and 42% of victims who were small to medium business owners reporting impacts on their business. The average amount lost per victim tends to be relatively low, although they can be substantial, and it hasn't changed since 2023. But the proportion of victims experiencing any harm from cybercrime has increased, and in particular, social and health-related harms. This demonstrates the importance of timely, consistent, and effective support to victims that can extend beyond financial consequences. The results I presented today are available in the Cybercrime in Australia 2024 report. We also have the Cybercrime dashboard, which has all of the information on victimisation prevalence, help seeking, financial losses, and other harms that I've talked about today. The dashboard also has interactive filters to look at trends and changes across time according to different socio-demographic characteristics like age, gender, or status as a small to medium business owner. So it builds on what's in the Cybercrime in Australia 2024 report. The report and dashboard are both available on the AIC website. Thank you for watching.